We were good.
We're good. We're actually good. Okay.
Well,
All right.
just
We
be
are
thankful.
live now. We are on live. I can see we have a few guests who have joined us. I am
We were
just
good.
going to. We're good. We're actually good. Okay.
Well,
All right. So we're on live now. And oh, we have some people already waiting. I'm excited about that. All right. So thank you everyone for joining us for this panel discussion. As you know, for some time now, I've fallen in love with panel discussions because you get to have a crop of incredible people who can join us and they can let us know their points of view about the pertinent issues that affect us as quilters, as textile artists, and those who are interested in African fabrics. So today I have with me Hollis Chatelaine, I have Bob Silverman, I have Cheryl Hills, and Sue Griffiths. Thank you so much for joining me, for accepting my invitation and honoring me with the wealth of your expertise, and your experiences as textile artists who use African fabric. So I'm just going to give everyone a minute to say a little bit about themselves, talk about their quilting journeys and maybe their interactions with African fabrics, and then we get into our discussions proper. So starting with Sue at the top of my screen. Hi, Sue. I'm so happy to see you.
Hi.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and then, yeah.
Okay, cut me off if I talk too long. I'm a New Zealander. I live in Australia because my husband's Australian, and I have been sewing and quilting since I was about 14. And you can see from the white hair that that was a while ago. So I've had a long history of a passion for quilting. And when I grew up, you couldn't get fabrics are very generic. We had dress fabrics. We didn't really have any dedicated quilting shops at all. So what I made was out of dress fabrics. Then as a young adult, I was living and working in Papua New Guinea, and I still quilted because I'm a bit obsessive. And I used what was available locally, and often that was what people made Mary blouses out of. So it was cotton, but it was imported, obviously, and I used that. Then I was working in Australia in Aboriginal communities as a linguist, and at that point there was no Indigenous fabric on the market at all, but there were then quilt shops. Now, of course, we have so much that's going on, and it's so exciting because we have the whole world at our fingertips, really. And so I've seen the quilting industry change from very little, especially at my end of the world, to this wonderful ability to sort of say, oh, this is from the UK, and this is from Africa, and this is from Australia, this is from New Zealand, and you can see this whole cultural richness that we have now. Okay, thank you, Miriam.
Hey, so thank you so much, Sue. I've always found your dual. I mean, you come from two nations that are rich in history. There's a lot of similarities between the culture traditions of the people of Australia, the people of New Zealand, and in Africa. So thank you so much for letting us know. So next on my screen is Miss Cheryl. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit about your quilting journey.
Hello, I'm Cheryl Hills. I originally from New Jersey in the States, but I've been living in the state of Maryland for the last 20 some odd years. I started sewing when I was around 9 or 10. My mother taught me, my grandmother sewed a little bit. From that point on, I sewed clothing, garments. When I got into high school, I really got heavily into garment sewing. It was one of those things where you didn't want to be seen wearing the same store-bought thing as another girl in the class. So I started making my own clothes. And then once I got into college, I purchased a sewing machine that could handle some of the newer projects that I was working on. So I started sewing things like coats and bags and upholstery. And then at that point, my mother made me a quilt out of some old clothes that I had. And that kind of sparked my quilting venture. I made my first quilt out of two bed sheets and batting and hand quilted it, and then went on to make a grandmother's fan quilt. And then kind of dropped the quilting for a little while and went back to garment sewing. And now I kind of do I like to say that I like to sew anything and everything. But after finding Miriam's quilt challenge, I did the Queen Quilt Challenge and just got hooked. And now the emphasis of sewing is quilting, even though I still sew kind of a little bit of everything. And the introduction to using African print fabrics has just opened up a whole new creative world for me. So my emphasis now really is in quilting, and I've been loving that journey so far.
Awesome. So happy to have you. And I know you have a great stash of fabrics that you dip into for your beautiful creations. So I'm really happy to have you here. Hi, Miss Holly. So excited to have you. It's been so long, like I said, but I'm really happy that we're reconnecting again today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again, Miriam. I'm assuming you asked me here because I lived in Africa. I lived in Burkina Faso, Mali, Togo, and Benin, all countries in West Africa, all French-speaking countries. And I lived there for a total of 12 years working for humanitarian organizations. I got involved in African textiles. That's where I started to quilt, just because the tailors were throwing away their scraps and giving them to the mechanics, and I just couldn't stand to see that the beautiful fabrics going to wipe up oil, and so I started teaching myself to sew with it. I spent just hundreds and hundreds of hours in markets speaking to the people who sold the fabrics, learning the histories around the fabrics. We even started a cottage industry, but I'm afraid we were ahead of the times in the 1980s and 90s to have tailors sew dresses, bags that I designed, and then tried to sell them in the United States, all with African fabrics. I've always had a very long love affair with African fabrics. And I even was friends with Chris Seydoux, who is the man from Mali who brought the mudcloth, the bogolan, out of Africa into Paris, into the designer shows. So I went to his funeral when he died, and that was in Mali. So I was very, very involved in the world of textiles in Africa. And it remains a very important part to me.
Awesome. I mean, I dare to say that I think Hollis probably knows more about the textiles of West Africa than I do, just by her involvement at the grassroots level. And in Africa, when you are in the grassroots, that's really when you get to know so much about what's, the culture and the tradition. So really excited to have your contributions in this discussion. So finally, the gentleman among us, and we've had the ladies, so we're going to have the gentleman now. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us.
You're welcome. Hey, my name is Bob Silverman, and I started quilting in 1996 and started out as a very traditional quilter, buying a magazine. There was no internet at that time. Buying a magazine, trying to copy the pattern, and going to a quilt shop and just buying the fabrics that looked like in the picture to duplicate it. But pretty quickly, I wanted to start kind of doing my own thing. And then my then partner at the time, now husband, and I opened up a quilt shop in 2001. And I started teaching classes, designing patterns, and doing more and more of using it more as a creative outlet. And of course, I had a store, so I had to sell things as well. But I enjoyed the creative part of it and designing my own quilts. As I said earlier, I did have some African fabrics, but in 2001, for whatever reason, I don't know why really, I felt it was disingenuous for me to use them. So I sold them, but didn't really get into it. As things progressed and moved on and my quilting career continued, I was introduced to African fabrics on a wider scale. There was more availability, I should say, like at quilt shows and of course online. And it was love at first sight. And I've been using them ever since. I do mix African fabrics with quilt shop fabrics, depending on what I'm doing. And we can talk more about that later, but I think that's fine. But I love the Ankara prints. I love the Bogolan inspired prints, and I just love using them. So that's kind of where I'm at now, although I still use other things too, but primarily I work with African fabrics now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for, I'm sure everyone watching will agree with me that we really have a wealth of different perspectives, different experiences, with the one thing common being just having used and just enjoying and appreciating, especially the most common of all African textiles, which is the Ankara. So we're going to go into our discussions now. And as you listen, if there's anything that you would like us to address, you have any questions that you've held in your heart or that will come off the discussions that we're having, please drop it in the chat and we will be really happy to, to address your questions as best as we can. So I'm going to kick off first, and please feel free to jump in with what is the fundamental difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. I'm going to, even though these words are nowhere near the topic of our discussion, they're words that float around so much, that this conversation wouldn't be complete until we actually address that. The difference, fundamental distinctions between the cultural appreciation and cultural appreciation as it's appropriation as it relates to either the wax prints or the more indigenous African fabrics. Anyone?
I'll start.
Okay, so I'll kick. All right.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I appreciating is, for me, buying. I use mostly Ankara prints, so I'll talk about that. Buying Ankara prints, I preferably from somebody I know, like you or one or two other people, where I know the source, where it's coming from. I feel like I'm supporting the person who's actually providing these, and using them on my quilts and then sharing that with people, whether it's online or at a quilt show or at a guild, what have you. I go to a sewing retreat once a month at my friend's place, and I sew with a bunch of ladies that we meet once a month, and everybody just brings whatever they're working on. And a lot of the ladies have never even seen African fabrics. And when I put my blocks up on the wall, they're kind of like, ooh, what's that? So then I get to talk about it. So to me, that's appreciation. Appropriation would be if, for example, I decided to start dyeing fabrics and I copied some of the petite prints or some of the designs, and then started, even if I wasn't producing it to sell, but claiming it as my own without citing a source. Just like if I make a quilt from a pattern and I let everybody think it's my original pattern and I don't credit the designer, to me, that's inappropriate. That is appropriation. I'm taking something from another person or another culture and claiming it as my own, or just being ignorant about it and not acknowledging it at all. Whereas appreciation would be saying, look at these, look at my quilt, look at these Ankara prints, aren't they gorgeous? Oh, these come from West Africa. And if they're interested in more, I can tell them more about it because I've learned more about it. I think that's really the only difference. It's really, I think, a matter of respect, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
I have to, oh, I'm sorry. I would agree with Bob.
No, go ahead.
I believe that it's really understanding where the fabrics come from and then respectfully using them. There are lots of ways that you can use fabric that's totally disrespectful. You could even take like a flag and make a garment out of it, which would not be using that fabric the way it should be used. And the same thing goes for African fabrics. I, like Bob, primarily use Ankara fabric, use some bazine, but and rarely will I mix in other types of fabric. But I really think that ignorance has a lot to do sometimes with the misappropriation. Just people just don't know, and sometimes people just don't want to know. They just like it and don't even realize that they're being disrespectful or misusing the fabric in a way that they shouldn't. So a lot of it has to do with just being educated and educating people about what it is you're using, why and how you're using it.
Thank you so much. Sue, Hollis?
I think that it's a complicated question because African fabrics started in the Netherlands and in England. And then the Java prints went to Indonesia, and the others, they went to Africa. And so Africans would design them there in Europe, but they were, when I lived in Africa, the prints, the wax prints that came from England or the Netherlands were considered to be the very best. It was a really high quality. And then the wax prints were the next best that were made in Africa, and they came from Nigeria, and they came from Accra, and they came from Ivory Coast and Senegal. And then there were a lot of different countries that had their own factories. And so in Africa, it was also a class thing that you could, this is my experience, where if you had the more expensive ones, they would last longer. And so there wasn't really a question of, who owns it, where did it come from, all of that. It was the quality of the fabric. When they came to the United States, I think things changed. It was in the last years that I was in Africa that there started to be knockoffs in the markets. And these were coming from Pakistan and China and Japan. And I can remember saying constantly, don't buy these fabrics, don't buy these fabrics. These are not true fabrics. And that, to me, is taking advantage of the people, taking advantage of the designs. And they didn't really know. And that is some of the fabrics. And when I would come to the United States, I could tell the difference. You could feel the difference in the fabrics. And so that's appropriation. But I think that it's much harder to, and then there's the cultural appropriation, and that's a whole different thing too. But I think it's much harder to know when you don't know fabrics. And I wouldn't know fabrics from other places. I only know that because I lived that. But I think that Cheryl, you have a really, really good point that a lot of people, they just don't know. And so they see something that's pretty and they will buy it, but it isn't really, the money is not going back to where it should going back to the African people, the African factories. And so I think that, that I'm only talking about the actual economic side of it. And of course, the cultural side is even way more complicated. So, and when I was doing things there, I mean, Africans were so excited that we were actually using their fabric and taking it out of the country that it hadn't really come to the United States quite yet. But I think that I can really understand the appropriation because African Americans have really had everything taken from them. And so I can understand they want to keep the fabrics because the fabrics that's part of the culture that's in Africa. And everybody expresses themselves through their fabrics. You wear a fabric as a statement. You buy a fabric as a statement. And all of these things are really, really important in the culture. And so I don't know. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, you did. I think everyone's making really good points. I certainly know Dutch people, just going back to your point about where the wax print started, and they feel huge amounts of pride in the African wax prints that were produced in the Netherlands. And a lot of quilters I know have a stash of the Dutch African the Dutch African wax prints, you know, like they feel a considerable pride in that industry. So that they feel that's part of their cultural heritage.
Mhm.
The other thing, going back to the comment about the respectful use of it, and you know, Cheryl, you said that, you know, you wouldn't use a flag as clothing, and I kind of went, why is the UK so okay with having Union Jack cushions, boxes, carpets, whatever, you know, like, and I thought that comes back to the point of that's really a majority culture, right? That is such a majority culture, and I think appropriation tends to be, if I can put it this way, when you're ripping off a minority culture. I'm not saying Africa's not huge, don't get me wrong, but if you're feeling like in your country, and I think a lot of African Americans may feel this way, I don't know, I haven't been to America, is that you almost feel like a minority in your own country. And as a, hang on, I don't want to say exile, as a New Zealander living in Australia, there's a lot of New Zealanders living in Australia, and it's not like you can tell except for the accent, but you do sort of feel not quite belonging. And I was thinking, how would I feel if people were utilizing my country's culture? And I know that okay, so what gets my dander up, right? I'll tell you a few things. One is some of my Dutch friends mixed up Australia and New Zealand fabric. Oh my God, I was so upset. It was like, no, if you see a kangaroo, it's probably Australia. Just, we don't have them in New Zealand. We don't have any animals in New Zealand except for one lizard called the tuatara. That's our only native animal species. So that got me upset. Even Miriam saying, oh, well, Australia and New Zealand are very similar, because my head's going, no, we're not, no, we're not, no, we're not. And then she said, and Africa. And I went, oh, yes, we are. Yes, we are. Yes, I got it. We're all colonial countries, Australia, New Zealand, and we're all colonial countries. And we've all got to deal with that aspect of our culture. So back to, why is it okay for the UK to put the Union Jack on boxer shorts, and you would not want to do that with a traditional print from, you know, like it's sort of like, oh, because we have Indigenous printed T-shirts and things for NAIDOC Week and so on, and that's okay. We're good with that. But I can also understand that, you know, like there's a disrespectful use. You don't want it maybe on the you know, where is it okay, where is it not okay, that we're sort of looking at. And for me, I'm using a lot of contemporary African prints. I haven't had the opportunity, let's just put it out there, to use the beautiful traditional prints, which I think are just amazing. But I don't feel any problem with using these African prints for the following reasons. One, I'm not making a profit from someone's culture. I'm just really enjoying the possibilities that the fabrics open up. Secondly, I'm supporting Miriam. I'm supporting the people who that Miriam employs to bring the African textiles to the world. So I'm feeling that I'm supporting the seller. And the other big reason is that I feel I'm really happy to share what I do with others. And I know the African History Quilt, the one for African History Month, where I had a whole lot of people. I do think that my fellow quilters sometimes look at me and go, don't quite get you, Sue. We don't quite get you, because I'm out of my wheelhouse. I'm out of my New Zealand Australian identity, I guess. So the African fabrics for me, I don't have any cultural connection to Africa. I don't have any ethnic connection. I don't have any cultural connection, but I love them to bits. But I also use them respectfully. I support the seller, and I share the passion. So that's where I think it's okay. I'm appreciating. appropriation would be, so lack of respect to me would be using something where I didn't understand the symbols and I didn't have a right to use the symbols. That would be appropriation. It would also be appropriation if I went, oh, well, I'll just design my own fabric line of African fabrics and sell them as African. And we have in my local area a coastal town called Byron Bay, very popular with tourists. There's so many products that come from the Byron Bay hinterland. They're miles away, they might be 100 kilometres away. They're using the name Byron Bay, to make their product more saleable. If I was using Africa, if I was saying, oh, look, I've designed these fabrics and that African fabrics, I would be using that word to make my product more saleable. That would be appropriation. And that's what I wouldn't ever want to go near. With Australian Indigenous fabrics, and I know this is big in the States, so I'm just adding this in, Miriam, I hope you don't mind. Check that selvage. If the selvage says designed by Mavis Ngugur and it's the Windhill Dreaming or something like this, you're good. Royalties from that pattern are going back to the designer. They designed it to be sold and used. Don't feel bad. If you see something which does not have the designer's name on it, just turn your nose up a little bit and walk past, because that will be a knockoff. And you don't want to do that. So buying fabric from Miriam, you can be sure that this is coming from Africa. It's what people in Africa are wearing and using and enjoying, and you're good. You're good to go. And I won't get into the fraud area of traditional fabric and symbols because that's not my area of expertise. I don't come from there.
Yeah, Miss Holly, please.
I would just like to say one more thing about what you said. Miriam lives in Africa, but Miriam will buy only African-made fabrics to sell because there are many knockoffs in Africa too, and they're a lot cheaper. So I think that having a source that you can count on is really, really important. And Miriam is a source that we can all count on. And
absolutely. So you see, for me, one thing Holly said in her first contribution was that the Africans were excited to have her interested in their fabrics. They were excited to have her take the fabrics out of the country. And so for the average African, there is a joy in sharing. There's a joy in sharing their heritage, their culture, because the people they are in touch with have their culture. And so nobody in Africa goes to someone else's culture to steal from or to celebrate or to appropriate, as it were, because your culture is enough for you. Your tradition is enough for you. Your tribal heritage is enough for you. So you really don't find that crossing over. I wouldn't go to Yoruba people and start selling their fabrics, for instance, or start trading off their culture because I have my culture. So the idea of cultural appropriation in the micro community of Africa is strange. It's actually strange. People don't just cross over. But now when you have the interaction from other cultures who appreciate what you have and they want to take it, you know, and they want to exploit it, if you like, or they want to celebrate it, that's kind of foreign to the local African. They understand appreciation, but we don't really understand appropriation. I don't know if that makes sense. I appreciate the Yoruba culture, but it doesn't even occur to me that I can make money off of. I'd rather make money off of my culture, because that trading is, my pride should be in my culture that I'm trading. I don't know if that kind of makes sense. Now, when you bring the issue of appropriation or appreciation to the wax prints, I call the wax prints the lingua franca of Africa. It's an imported thing. It doesn't belong to Africans. Africans have accepted it. Now, then you have complications. When you throw in the economic factors, it becomes even more complex. Because right from the 90s, indigenous textile mills stopped producing in Nigeria. They have basically stopped producing across Western Africa because Western Africa is the largest consumer of this wax prints. And so they were the ones who were invested to have the mills in their countries. And so you now have the mills that are in Africa are owned as subsidiaries, if you like, of the Dutch company.
Or the Chinese.
That's the truth. Or the Chinese. I don't think the Chinese, have they been bold enough to come? I don't think they've been bold enough to establish the textile mills yet. The ones
Maybe
that are
Nigeria, but in other countries.
For Nigeria, they still bring them in. They don't produce in Nigeria. They still bring them in. But if you're looking at the mills in Ghana, you're looking at the mills in Senegal, I think they're the ones who are actually actively producing now. They are not owned by Africans. And so when you tell me you want to buy made in Africa fabric, it kind of scatters my head a little, because do you want it because it is made on the African soil using African water and African hands? Or do you want it because the economy, do you want it because it's made by Africans? Do you want it made by Africans or because it's owned by Africans? So you have to decide what your reason is for saying you want made in Africa textile.
And can I just add to that, Miriam? Can I
Yeah.
just add to that? In Australia, we assume that all our fabric is made and printed overseas. It is all offshore. We have nothing, to the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, made and printed here. We assume that everything will come from offshore, that it might be designed here, but it will be made elsewhere.
Exactly.
That's our reality.
That's
So I want to
actually the
make
same in the United States. Very little is actually made here. Most of the quilt shop quality fabric companies, the fabric is designed here, and almost zero, or it may be zero, is actually made in America.
Yeah.
Same thing here.
Yeah.
But
the African
the Apple says designed in San Francisco and made in China. We see that, so I understand what you mean. Sorry, Hollis.
I'm sorry. I know that in Mali, when I lived there, the African, I mean, what they were producing there, the cotton was actually grown in Africa.
Yes.
And
yes.
it was printed in Africa. And it was not the high quality cloth, but it was that. But the Chinese bought their factory.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
you know, you're right. It's a really, really difficult thing because you can't know.
You really can't know. For the ones in Nigeria, it was owned by a branch of the Velisco. The one in Ghana, I believe the GTP is also owned by Velisco, unless they have changed hands. The indigenous fabrics in Africa, the ones in Nigeria, have been shut down. The ones that were operated by the government, the ones that were operated by the business people of Africa have actually shut down. So you see, you put me in a very difficult position when you say, Miriam, we love your fabrics, but we want made in Africa fabrics.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that I have discovered over time is someone like me who is into, and my big dream, so if you can support me in any way, my big dream is to actually design African fabrics specifically for quilters, right? I want to do that. So there is possibly no way I can do that in Africa, because the infrastructure cannot, I cannot afford to produce in Nigeria because the infrastructure is so poor. I'm going to have to buy power at an exorbitant cost. So now, right now, the only way I can make fabrics that I can't make them here. I have to outsource it to any one of these countries that we're talking about, because it's going to cost cheaper. And not simply because I want higher margins, but because it will be near impossible for me to produce it right here in Africa using all the resources that we have. So I want you to understand it from both a cultural, traditional, and also economic point of view when we are talking about. Now, I try as much as possible to buy brands that are owned by Africans, but produced elsewhere. And that elsewhere is likely going to be Asia. Elsewhere is likely going to be China or India. So you have to choose how you want to support made in Africa.
Do you know, when I went to India and we visited a silk sari producing factory, which was amazing. It was just so high tech. We couldn't take any photos inside, but it was just incredible. It was high tech factory. We also visited a hand spun, hand woven factory, right? Which is like a cottage industry almost. What they were producing was used for the school uniforms, and I went, oh, my head hurts. Children are going to school wearing hand spun, hand woven cloth. Oh my God! This is like, my head is now blown. I want some hand woven cloth for me, and it's precious. But obviously what the workers were getting paid in this very much cottage industry was very low compared to what was happening in the silk factory. And it really went, yeah, India's had a long history of weaving their own, spinning and weaving their own fabrics. Yes, they have. And this is what's happened to it. It's become the poor cousin of the stuff that can be produced in big factories. So I'm still dealing with the mind-blowing impact of realizing that children are going to school wearing hand-woven, hand-dyed, hand-spun fabric.
That's just the legacy of colonialism, where colonials made you feel like what you did, irrespective of the centuries of expertise that goes into the production, was of a lower quality. That's a legacy of, it's everywhere in colonial countries. It's here in Africa. There's no value for anything that's made with the hands, but if it comes out of a high-tech process, then it is priced higher. That's just the legacy of
we have colonial cringe too, cultural cringe.
Also, when I lived in Burkina Faso and Sankara was the president, he forced all of the people who worked for the government to wear hand-woven fabric in order to boost all of the local industry and to give more value to the hand-woven fabrics. So you can also look at it like that. It was cheaper to buy, regular cloth that you could get at the market that came from wherever else in the world. But everybody had to. You had to do it. That became a law. And so it was, there are different ways to look at it also.
But
that
also brings us to the ethical sourcing. The aspect of ethical sourcing now comes with, like I said, the issues of Africa are so complex, because now if we had lawmakers who would pass that into law, then you give African-made fabrics a fighting chance. But as it is, the lawmakers, now, Hollis also said something very interesting. She said it was a status thing. Fabrics in Africa right now, even right now, is a status thing. And so in one of the times I was live in the Facebook group, I told you this is considered a higher status, the fabric of what I generally supply to you. I said that to you. It's a little softer. It's a little this, it's a little that. That is what, there's a higher brand, the one that actually comes out of Holland, that is so out of my reach. I wouldn't even think about going to buy that, not for myself, for clothing or for anything, because it's ridiculous to me. So it's a matter of, it's a status thing. And the status thing still ties back to what Sue said about those are made in factories. Anyone that would be made here with maybe less mechanized means would not be found to be valuable. And so it brings you to the point of ethical sourcing, which is another thing that we've actually been discussing that. I just want us to cap it up to say, how do you consider, knowing all of these facts now, what would you consider ethical sourcing of African fabrics? The only way I can contribute to ethical sourcing is when it comes to indigenous fabrics. I can tell you it's so easy because you get to go to the source communities of the tribes responsible for that type of fabric, and so you know what you're getting. But every other thing, it's just it's whatever you get, you get.
Miriam,
so
go ahead. Sorry. No, I would trust you in your sourcing wherever you get your fabrics made. I think we would be, as quilters, or just as consumers, I should say, I think it would be naive to not think that we live in a global economy at this point. I don't think there's any sovereign country on the planet that produces all of everything that's needed or used in that country. I can't imagine that place exists. So we do live in a global economy. With that said, I would trust you to source wherever you're sourcing, and that's your business. Literally, that's your business. And I just trust you to do the right thing to the best of your ability. And sometimes we don't live in an ideal world where everybody makes a great living wage and has great working conditions and so on and so on and so on. And nothing, they don't use toxic dyes. And it's just not realistic because almost nothing would ever get produced. I want to jump back to something about the appropriation, though, because this has been bugging me and I've been wanting to say something. I think it's a bigger issue in the United States with African Americans, and I could be wrong, but I think it's a bigger issue here when, like in the 70s, when white guys started wearing dashikis or doing cornrows or that kind of thing. To me, that's very much appropriation. And I think it jumps back to like jazz, invented by Black folks, co-opted by white folks. Southern cuisine, I live in Alabama, Southern cuisine is so on and so on and so on were appropriated. So I just think the topic itself is a little bit more sensitive here because of our racial history in this country, whereas in other places it might, like wearing the Union Jack in the UK, might not be as big a deal. Here, people are just a little bit more touchy, actually, about how things are used, why they're used, and who's using it. So with that said, though, as quilters, again, if I'm buying from a person that I know and they're sourcing it and I'm helping them make their living and then I'm enjoying the use of it and then I'm sharing it, kind of like Sue had shared, I think that's the way the world should be.
Yes. I think that's a good summation of it. Yeah.
Can I just loop back to something you're talking about with we are from colonial countries, all of us, including America. And that can often lead to a lesser respect, maybe, for the original cultures, if I can maybe put it that way. And that would be the American Indian culture, the Maori culture, the Australian Aboriginal culture. That how does that pride in that culture develop? And this is back to the sharing aspect. Back in the 80s, there was an exhibition of Maori art that went through America, and it got rave reviews. People loved it. And when it came back to New Zealand, it was on at the Wellington Museum. People went, oh, people love our culture. Oh, maybe we do too. And although it was something we'd been brought up with, it's just part of daily life, that sense of pride occurred because other people went, wow, we love it. And that led to a whole resurgence in Maori art and culture. That one travelling exhibition led to this. And I think that the sharing of African culture in a respectful way in a way that supports the seller, in a way that the source is known and acknowledged, can also lead to a resurgence in pride. And I think, honestly, Miriam, I think you've seen that over the time that you've been working with Quilt Africa Fabrics, like building Quilt Africa Fabrics, is that you've now got a huge amount. Like, I see the quilts coming out, and there's this excitement in the African heritage and the African design and the African fabrics. And I take your point, Bob. I've seen that too, that people are sort of like, but this is ours, we want to keep it. But also the museums, the exhibitions, the wow has that factor, which means that other people are saying this is awesome. And I actually think the other people saying this is awesome is part of the pride. And that as a colonial culture is important, and as a minority culture, being able to display who you are to the world, and have the world go, wow, I think that's also really important.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I would also throw in the economic piece. You as a people would have pride in the fact that people are now recognizing your culture and the things that represent your culture, but other people are also economically benefiting from that as well. And that, again, brings us into that circle of appropriation. There's always going to be an economic factor, and who reaps the rewards from that will determine some of that pride, and some of that is, well, they're just taking it from us. What are we getting from it? Even though we're proud of it, we want people to see it, there's still that economic factor that somebody else may be profiting.
I absolutely agree that nobody should be profiting in that way from someone else's culture. I absolutely agree. I also, and honestly, as a New Zealander, culturally a New Zealander, you can't tell me that I can't use my culture. Like, I can use koru. That's my culture. I can use that. I can tell the story about Rangi and Papa. That's my culture. You can't tell me I can't. I'm not Maori, I'm Pakeha, but you can't tell me that. So culture. So I think that was interesting about culture. What, who owns culture is where that's going. Because culture is what you're brought up with. It's not ethnicity so much as it's who you are and how you're brought up. It's what shaped you as an individual. So I was shaped by the country and the culture I was brought up in. That's my culture. Whether it's part Pakeha, it's part Maori, it's part all sorts of things, it's part English, but that's my culture. So
I think we have actually exhausted the ethical sourcing, the ethical perspectives, and even the hidden information, the hidden things that should help, our decision making, because of the complexity of the situation. The wax print being the most popular, the wax print not being of African origin, definitely heavily influenced by the traditions and the cultures of Africa, by African designers, African people, African patterns, African consumption. Africa is the highest, and Nigeria is the highest consumer of the wax print, and but then you also, like I think everyone pointed out, you cannot take out the economics and the complexities of interference from other places out of the equation. And so we would just say, whether the indigenous fabrics or the wax prints, try and make sure that at least it has some heavy involvement by Africans. I think that is fair, irrespective of the fact that origin is Dutch, the fact that it is identified as African used by Africans. If you can just look past that. And that brings us to this question by Toya. She said, how can you distinguish between Asian originating fabrics when purchasing in markets? Many of these fabrics are not labeled. It still takes me back to, and closing this topic, it still takes me back to what Hollis said. Don't look at it in terms of place of manufacture. Look at it from the terms of the quality of what you're getting. Look at it from the terms of whose hands has it passed through? Whose hands has it passed through? And then where are you ultimately getting it from? I think that serves you better when you're thinking in terms of African fabrics. The quality. But typically, you know the knockoff just by the quality. And the quality is even available in our markets here. It's not that it's not available. It's just that I don't use them personally. I'm not going to stock them in my store. And so the African perspective is different from maybe the global perspective. You are thinking in terms of made in Africa. We are thinking in terms of quality. Quality. So I would say if you go to the markets, remember at the back of your mind that Africa is a non-producing continent. So do not be hung up on looking for made in Africa. Chances are you will not find so much. The countries where these factories are, in Mali, in Senegal, even in Ghana, they don't consume as much as Nigeria. Nigeria does not have a factory for infrastructural reasons. So I will advise you, learn what makes up good wax prints. Is it 100% cotton? Is it color fast? Is it good? Let that guide you. Because the chances are every wax print you buy is either coming from Europe or it's coming from Asia. And so I rest my case on ethical sourcing. You know, where you buy from is now strictly a matter of, oh, we know Miriam, she's 100% in Nigeria, she's there, she's going to get it for us and it's good quality. Or, you know, you want to go to the factory that is, the cotton is grown in Africa and the hands that are working it are African hands, but not in terms of ownership. Don't think in terms of ownership of African fabrics, except they're indigenous. That's the only place you can make those claims. And so we've really covered a lot of the questions I already have. But one thing I want to ask is, how do you honor in the midst of all of this appreciation, appropriation, understanding the economics behind the wax prints? How do you now preserve the culture, the tradition, the identity of Africa and African fabrics in expressing your art as a quilter and as a textile artist?
That's an interesting question. My answer will be fairly short, so I'll go first. Whatever I do, I don't make anything where, if I'm making a quilt with African fabrics, I do not think of Australia or New Zealand. All of my quilts that are made with African fabrics, I'm either thinking of Africa, so like a sort of African animals, African flora and fauna, African life, the big starry sky, all of these things. I'm actually thinking of Africa itself. That's one thing, and sometimes I'm thinking of Africa through the world, if you like, like the African people, where they are, who they are, what they're doing. But I'm always going back in my headspace to Africa when I'm making something. So the one I made with I had little quotes from proverbs. I said, Miriam, just tell me some Nigerian proverbs. And I loved them, and I put them on the quilt, and that was a really nice thing, like I still remember, the baby on the mother's back doesn't know the road is long. I went, yeah, it's so true. So true. So I think of I don't make anything with an inspiration from Australia or from New Zealand, I make it with thinking about Africa and the little that I know.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Thank you so much. Yeah, I also want to say that there's an exhibition that Hollis had where she captured the life of her community, where you see the grandfather, you see the girls, you see the women, you see that. And, I thought that was a fantastic way of telling the African story as well. When you look at the aspects of Africa that you love, or the aspects of the people, it doesn't even have to be their people, but the ethos of Africa, and you try to translate that into your work, just giving that respect and acknowledgement to like a fashion designer who wants to use Indian fabric. The first thing you're going to do is, how do the Indians wear them? You're not necessarily going to make them in the style of the Indians, but you're thinking, how do the Indians wear them? And then you give a nod, so to speak, to the way they do it, and then you put your own twist, I think, to it. I think for me, that is and particularly as a unicorn quilter in Nigeria, I always think, when I'm using the fabrics, how would I use these fabrics in a way that will attract Nigerians to my work, to quilting? How they will look at it and say, wow, that is sweet mother. I love how you did that. How did you, because when they see the fabric, they have an instant connection. And then when they see how you use it, it should draw them in and make them feel good about themselves. Make them feel good, make them feel like the New Zealanders felt about the art circling the world. And they said, wow, so you mean with this African fabrics that we use to mop up oil in the mechanics workshop, we can do that, we can create something so beautiful with it. So for me, that's how I try to, as a quilter, that's how I try to use the fabrics in a way that draws people in.
I wanted to, what you mentioned, we're talking about was, I made a coloring book called Stories of West Africa. And since the fabric is such an incredibly important part of the culture, I did drawings of people, and they were friends, almost all of them. And behind them on every page was a drawing based on an African fabric. So the design in the background was all African fabrics. And that was really important to me because the African fabrics are so important, and they bring such joy. They're so colorful and delightful. And then I did an exhibition, because I did drawings of each one of the drawings that I had in my coloring book. And then I did an exhibition where I took my drawings and I had them printed at spoon flour. And then I made pieces that were 40 inches by 34 inches. And that exhibition traveled for a while. But it was really, when these pieces were hung side by side, and there were 15 of them, and I would walk into that room, it was like I could feel the joy that I felt when I lived there, because of the brightness, it was just absolutely wonderful. I loved it. And I think before I did that, way back when I lived in Africa, and I happen to have this little picture, this is one of the first quilts that I ever made, all made with African fabrics. This is made back in, I don't know, early 90s. But what I really wanted to do was just bring the joy that I felt from the fabrics, and in putting them together. And because for me, that's what the African fabrics always brought to me. So I guess that's maybe just another way, or way tweaked a little bit of what you said, where I take what the fabrics mean to me respectfully, and then put my 2 cents in when I made it.
I think for me, when I am creating, I to this day haven't, probably won't ever use the symbols as any kind of focal point in any piece that I make. And for me, it's just sort of that crossing between being respectful, appropriation, all of those things. My enjoyment in using African fabrics is the fact that it has changed my perspective in what I think is enjoyable art. I used to be someone, everything had to match, and it had to be totally symmetrical. And now with the prints and the vibrant colors and being able to mix and match is just something that is just taking me totally out of my wheelhouse. And I'm absolutely loving the fact that I can make a collage quilt and put all these different beautiful fabrics next to each other, where 5 years ago, I would have thought that was just a mess. And why would anybody put those clashing colors next to each other? I'm absolutely loving that. So for me, the use of the fabric is the joy of being able to mix and match and just enjoy the colors that come with all of the different prints.
Awesome. Yeah. Bob, you want to add a little something, or we move on to the next?
I just I like Cheryl, I just love the fact that, in my opinion, any on-carve print that I like goes with any other on-carve print that I like. Because of the amount of color and pattern, it just becomes its own thing when I sew the blocks together. And that is, I think people get the joy and life from it. I mean, you can't look, it may not be their taste, but they cannot look at it and say it's not lively. And I think that's what I really love about it.
Thank you so much. So we are looking to round up now, and I'm going to go personal and ask if you've encountered any challenges or successes, you know, in the expression of your art with African textiles. You know, have you overexcited anyone? Have you incited some cultural sensitivity? Have you been confronted, you know, by anyone because of the way you use it or the way you don't use it, or, you know, and all of that? I think for me, it has always been, why are you making these fabrics accessible to everyone? It should only be to people of a certain heritage or a certain, or, you know, and all of that. And I'm like, my contribution to the world is from a purely African place. In Africa, we do not withhold culture. We celebrate culture. We get excited when you eat our foods. We get excited when you dress in our traditional clothes and you put on the beads and you're dancing to the drums. You know, it's not something that we hold to ourselves and say, hey, this is mine. I can't let you have it. So I approach my business with that same understanding, you know, that I have. Hey, this is my culture. I'm inviting you in. I'm inviting you to take the same enjoyment that I take from the things that is ours, that is around us. You know, I want you to see what I see. I want you to experience the beauty and the joy that I experience from. And so for some time, you know, especially in the beginning, it shook me, and I'm like, maybe I should do I need to adjust my stand? But I just can't do that. You know, I just can't do that, because and I came to the conclusion that there's nothing wrong with me sharing, because if I share to you and you have a piece of it, or you have a truckload of it more than I do, you can't out-African me. I always say that you cannot out-African me by taking the things to me. You know, if you buy up my inventory all the time, you cannot out-African me. If today I find I just have a few pieces of the fabrics, it still doesn't change my Africanness. You know, and so when I came to that realization, I decided, look, I'm still going to share the joy, because that's what we know. we share the joy, we share the culture, and we share the stories. And that is what I've tried to do by the challenges, by the block of the month, by hosting forums like this where we just come and I try to help you understand my culture so you can see it from my perspective and take joy from it. So I really want to hear your stories. Have you ever created something and you took it somewhere and they're like, Hollis, you're white. Why are you using these fabrics? What do you mean about the stories of Africa? You don't have a right to talk about that. Or to say, Bob, what are you doing? Why on earth, are you so crazy about these fabrics? And, or maybe Cheryl, you got flack because you're not using African fabrics enough. You're Black, all your works should be African fabrics or, stuff like that. People react to us in different ways. And I really want to hear your stories because I think it will make a difference to someone somewhere.
I personally haven't heard anything negative from anybody, Black or white, when they've seen anything that I've made. Honestly, maybe it's just the people I hang out with that I'm exposed to. I don't know, but I have not seen anything negative. I post my quilts on Facebook and Instagram, and I've not had one negative comment. So that's my experience.
That's great. Yeah.
I'd like to say that my experience also has been positive. Nobody has ever come up to me and said, why are you doing this? Or why aren't you doing this? I put a couple of my quilts on display at a Black History Month event. And one of those was the collage quilt of the continent of Africa. It actually turned out to be an educational piece because African Americans don't necessarily get African history in school and definitely not at home. So as that piece hung, people came up and said, oh, where's such and such a country? Where is that country? And the quilt actually turned out to be something that I brought it to show you like my art, and they came and were educated a little bit about the continent of Africa, and that Africa is not a country, it's actually a continent. So it definitely, for me, was positive, and I didn't hear anything about, why are you using fabric from here? It was so I've had nothing but a positive experience.
Fantastic. Great. Hollis?
Well, I think that I'm a little bit different because I do a lot of African people. And I have been rejected from venues because I'm not African. And I haven't done as many African people now because the way I feel is when I started doing this back in 1997, painting my very, very large African imagery, African people, nobody, well, first of all, nobody was doing dye painting, but nobody was painting large faces, large African faces. But the times have changed. And I feel like I kind of, in doing that, I changed the attitude about that. You used to see the African art, there were no faces. It was like they didn't exist. And now I almost feel like I've passed the baton on to many African Americans who are now making quilts that they didn't, I don't know if they didn't think about it before. I don't really know, but times have changed. It's been a long time since I started. And I know people have told me, you cannot show this work because you're white. And for me, but at the same time, when I did my Stories of West Africa exhibition, and here's an example of a few of them. And when I did this exhibition and it was in Houston, it was so interesting because there were 3 or 4 Africans who came to see it, and they absolutely loved it because they said, we never see Africa portrayed positively. And this is all positive. And that was my goal, because I wanted to show my love for the people that I lived with. And so they said, we don't see, and even Africans, they don't often do happy imagery. And I really worked very hard to show nothing negative. So I think that respect is really important too. But on the whole, in all the years I've been doing it, and I've been doing it for 30 years, it's been way, way more positive than negative, which is really, really wonderful for me, because I feel like I've been able to tell really positive stories about my very positive experience of living in Africa for 12 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I'm just running on from what you said there. This is, once again, I'm talking from my context. My daughter who's Australian, she's brought up in Australia. She's also got New Zealand citizenship, but one job she had, it was the first time she'd lived in New Zealand. She walked in, she works in museums, and they said, "Oh, look, Matariki's coming up. You've got to do this, 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 and this." And she said, "Okay, that, and I shall do that." And then she was in a meeting, and someone said, "You're white. You know, you're a Pākehā. You don't have the right." And a Maori person who'd been not working with her, but also part of the council, said, No. She knows what she's doing. She's fine. Just leave it to her. She'll do a great job. And this person hadn't known her for very long, but they could see that she had the respect and she was going to do a great job. So the colour didn't matter to someone, and the other person was sort of like, no, I want to hold on to it. And they, of course, she did it, and it was absolutely wonderful, and people loved it, and they kept coming back, and so on, etc., etc. But that's sort of a situation where it's, to me, does the colour matter, or does the engagement almost matter? Does the respect matter? Does the sharing matter? And I'm also like a little bit, this is a personal story, I'm also a little bit vague on faces. I have to admit this. I often don't recognise people. And when I was in New Guinea, my first year teaching, and we had to be inspected by the school inspector, and which I was. And then he went away again. And then someone a day later said to me, "Oh, was he an expatriate or was he a New Guinea person?" And I kind of went, glasses, moustache. I don't know. And I genuinely didn't. It sounds, to a lot of people, this sounds like the first thing you're ever going to notice, because I think in America that's sort of important. But to me, I was brought up in New Zealand. I genuinely did not know until I looked back at class photos who was Maori and who wasn't. So to me, in my lived experience, it's kind of like the issue is not the colour. The issue is are you respectful? Are you sharing this culture? Are you sharing the joy? Are you being part of that lived experience? And I think, Hollis, that's your lived experience. That's what you're sharing. You're sharing the joy of that lived experience. And I think everyone here is. Bob is, Cheryl is, Miriam is. It's the joy of the lived experience and the lived culture that's being shared by everyone. And I hope I didn't make myself sound really strange there, but I genuinely never noticed. It just doesn't cross my mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think we started off really intense, and during the course of that intensive, ethical, economic, I think we've answered a lot of questions, and I really hope that anyone listening has you have to shift your position a little when you're thinking of African fabrics. You're thinking of context. You're thinking of the complexities. I keep going back to complexities because honestly, as an African living in Africa, I can't think of it in any way other than being complex. But I want us to end by jumping off this point that Hollis made. She said, I am just expressing, I did this because of my love for the people, and my art, I was just looking to express the joy that I felt, the emotions that were stirred in me by living among these people. Now, for most of maybe the Quilt Africa community, the tribe, you may not have the luxury of spending 12 years among my people. I wish I could invite you for 12 years and we just live right here in Nigeria. But you would most likely not have the luxury, of having 12 years living in the community, studying them, looking at them. But I think, so my final question is, looking at the way the fabrics and maybe the stories of Africa, whether the ones you hear from me during the course of our events or what you have learned from elsewhere, how do you take all of these experience and how do you put it into your work, and how do you share them? How do you get people to kind of look at it from your point of view? For the past 7 years of Quilt Africa Fabrics, I've been trying to get everyone to look at it from my point of view as an African, as an African creative like you. Look at it from my point of view. You have to drop the idea that maybe Africa is far, is mysterious, is this, and then let's just come around the common ground of beauty and creativity and breaking your own creative boundaries. So I'm just trying to say, what are the ways that you can take all of these things that either the fabric means to you or the stories, the ethos of Africa? How are you going to express that and share that and hopefully pass the baton on to someone? Because if you don't do something, if you don't break a little boundary, you really don't have anything to pass. You're at the same level with anyone. And that's what I try to say during our challenges. I may give you the rules and the guidelines, but I really want you to go above and beyond what I say. I want you to put your spin on it. I want you to allow things to speak to you so you can, and you can't do that if you are just a participant, you are just a spectator. At some point, you have to engage with the fabrics. At some point, you have to make decisions about the fabrics. Are you approaching the fabrics the way you approach every other fabrics, the batiks from Indonesia, the quilting cotton in your neighborhood quilting shop? You have to make some decisions on how to engage with the fabrics, knowing everything that you know now about what we're trying to say, the source, the origin, the use, the perspectives, the African feelings. How are you going to engage in a way that you share that with the world, and then hopefully you get that ripple effect of passing it on, breaking a few barriers, because one thing Hollis's Stories of Africa did for me was it emboldened me, because I saw someone creating art with a face that looks like my grandfather. There was one, I think, of a man, an elderly man playing with a child, and I thought to myself, that could be my grandfather playing with me when I was little. Or ladies carrying things on their head. Oh, those look like my cousins. And so for me, when I was starting, I think that was the first summit and Hollis was a guest and I encountered her work. It made me bold in what I was doing, in the sense that here is someone who has lived in Africa, who has understood and is not afraid to tell the real African story. And so she gave me courage to actually keep pushing, keep telling the stories, keep telling the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly about Africa, So I think ultimately as artists, we do have that responsibility of speaking truth. And I say that art is one way that you are non-confrontational with your issues. You can express yourself in art and you're not confrontational. No one will look at your art and say, it looks like you were squeezing your face when you made that. Nobody can say that, but you have passed the message. You've passed the message across, even if it's a hard message, so that's how I want us to round up by, just exploring things from that perspective a bit.
Okay.
I don't know. I think I spoke a lot. Was I clear? I spoke quite a bit. I may have hidden the question in all of the things that I said. I'm trying to ask what steps can you take personally, or maybe as a quilting community or textile art community, to promote good engagement, ethical, honest engagement with African textiles, knowing all the things that you know about African fabrics?
I'm going to have to think about that one. That's a lot. And I don't want to just come up with a quick answer just to have an answer. I'm going to have to let that one percolate a little bit, Miriam.
I'll take sort of a superficial stab at it. For me, I appreciate having met Miriam and having been educated by her about Africa. And I've told her that it's great to receive the information unfiltered, because here in the US, there's a spin put on something. It's always altered in some way, sometimes to promote the negative, but having a direct connection to Miriam has definitely educated me in just being able to learn about Africa, African fabrics from someone who lives and breathes the culture. So what that's done for my quilting journey is I see in my future my use of African fabrics in a sort of a what I'm going to call a cross-cultural way, in that I'm going to use African fabrics in some traditional quilt blocks. And one of the things I see in my future is a double Irish chain quilt with African fabrics. So using fabrics and quilt blocks that are associated with other countries and cultures with African fabrics. So that is the future that you've sort of helped me create for part of my quilting journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I like
Yeah,
the fusion idea, that we don't have to be one thing or another, that we each have an individual voice and individual experience, and the fabrics, I think we all agree the fabrics speak to us with joy. But I was going to say that the first lot of fabrics I think you sent me, Miriam, I went, wow, these are all heroes. Every single piece of fabric is a hero fabric. You want it, you want it large and front and center. Oh, okay, I wonder if they have any non-heroes. But no, every fabric was just right there, and it was like, oh, how do we celebrate these fabrics? So I had to throw my ideas out of the window and go, just start and think, start again. And I think that every year I've tried to do something different. I know the blue and white one, Miriam, I said, oh, we're going sophisticated this year. We're going contemporary sophisticated. That's what we're trying to go for. Not me, but that's what we're trying to go for. And then there's the celebrating culture. That was the African history one. There was the celebrating, like all these different things. And the one behind me is definitely very fusion, because it was based on a traditional quilt block with a twist. The flowers are cut from the fabric, the African fabric, in a way that celebrates the fabrics. But I called it Jane Austen Goes to Africa because the excitement that she and her sister Cassie had when they were getting these chintzes from India is, I think, very much the excitement that we have when we're getting these exciting fabrics from Africa. It just seemed like the same level of, oh my goodness, look at this, have you got a bit of this, and they would write each other letters and send each other bits of fabric for the quilt, and it seems to be in the same way that we're really celebrating these hero fabrics in a way that lets them dance. They want to dance, and this just lets them dance. So I don't know if that answers your question, Miriam, but I just love responding to the fabrics themselves.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Hollis.
I am I love listening to you, Miriam. I love listening to you because of your passion. And I think that passion is a really important word here, because if we each follow our own passion, it will come across when we use the fabrics. So if somebody wants to do a double wedding ring with them and they use the fabrics that they feel passionate about, it will come across like that. I am in my art, I use more realism. So even the one that I showed you that had the rays in it, it was based on realism. But that's my passion, so that's how I used the fabrics. When I did my stories of West Africa, even though there were drawings of people and they were all quilted, the background was the fabrics because that's my passion. So I think if we can all find our own passion and use the fabrics in the way that we love to see them. And as you say, they dance, they want to dance. And I think that will show not only our personality, but it'll show off the fabrics with our personality. And so I think that that's something that they will be different with each person. And that's one of the wonderful things about quilting. It's kind of like gardening. You walk into anybody's garden, it's going to be different than the one next door, the one down the street, because we put our personalities into it. Well, here we have a beautiful, um, what's the word I want? Palette of fabrics in all different colors and all different styles and designs. And so if we put our passion with that, we will do justice for the fabrics, we will respect the fabrics, and we will have beautiful work.
Absolutely agree. I totally agree. And I think that's something we've been exploring in the block of the month. We've been providing the patterns, but we say sometimes the idea you have in your head requires you to go 10 steps harder, 10 steps further. Are you going to be true to that idea and putting in the work required to bring out that truth? And so everybody is all about speaking your truth, but sometimes speaking that truth is so difficult, it's so hard, it requires more of you than you are willing to give. And so I say that to the members of the block of the month, not strictly because you're using the African fabrics, but because this is your thing and you owe it to yourself to pour out that passion. And sometimes passion is a hard task master, because passion will take you, because it makes you put it all in until that thing in your head, you're able to capture it. And I think especially in this year's block of, that's what we've been seeing everybody do. This was not what I thought I wanted. And so I'm tweaking it a little bit. And for me, that is the best way to tell the story using the fabrics. When you allow it to just sweep you away, and rather than resisting, you just follow through, and then the fabric always rewards. Honestly, the fabrics will always reward you in how it eventually turns out, because the palette is exciting. The color, even the patterns, they shock you because you think, oh, this is too bold. But you go ahead and you work with it and it turns into something that you never expected. So I love what everybody has said about taking that step. And I think it's always about, it starts with you and it really ends with you, So I said that was the final question. That's not really the final question. The final question is, what are your thoughts about putting the African fabrics on the quilting stage, on the global quilting stage? So we know that the US, America has the broadest platform for quilters, and from 7 years, I have seen a change, an improvement, I dare say. When I came on, nobody was accepting projects with African fabrics, really rarely. But in the past few years, I have seen a space being created to say, okay, yeah, if you have African fabrics and it meets our technical conditions or whatever, go ahead and enter it in. Thank you so much, Bob. Really appreciate it. See you soon. All right. So that's my final question. What do you think about this push? What do you think about my push? And what do you think about the push of the people who have been awakened to the fabrics? They're doing so well now. They're becoming technically adept at just putting the fabrics and telling a story that is not common to the quilting scene. What's the place of African fabrics? What's the future of African fabrics? Do we see it dwindling? Is it a phase? Is it passing? Is it okay? Is it not okay? Why are we expecting the quilting judges to learn new rules to accommodate this new kid on the block?
I think, Miriam, that since you started, I have noticed that on the one hand, there's a lot more being made, a lot of pride in what's being made, and a lot of, in America particularly, and a lot of more display opportunities. I think it's, and I definitely don't think you have to I think you've started a resurgence. I don't know where it's going,
Sue,
but I think you're
Sue.
making it
Oh,
mainstream. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
all right. I wanted to give Hollis a chance to say a little something. But yeah, I mean,
I'm
3 is a
sorry.
good
I'm
number.
sorry.
Yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine. I think she really needed to go. So thank you so much for that contribution. You're right. There has been a shift. There has been a total shift in the landscape of quilting, more accommodation, more, like you said, more boldness. We're just getting bolder, creating our stuff, whether traditional or art quilt, whatever, and then just putting it out there. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, sure.
One little thing. I think you just touched on it. I think as quilting moves away from function and more into art, and people begin to view quilts as works of art and not necessarily just something that's functional that keeps us warm on our bed, I think it becomes more accepting, and it gets to be displayed in more different places, because we're not just hanging a blanket on the wall. There's now creativity and color and design that all went into creating that piece, which I think is becoming more accepted, that quilts are actually art.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
The other thing is, I can see a lot of kids, like if I was an African American kid and I could have, mum was a quilter and she made me something with African fabrics, I'd be just stoked. And as an Australian, or living in Australia, I try and always put it, not in my African quilts, but in all other quilts, I try and put a little bit of Aboriginal fabric in it, because these quilts are based here. That's what, and it's sort of like, it's like an identity mark. It's like a fingerprint. It's like a thumbprint. And I kind of think that fingerprint might be where people are sort of going, no, that all my quilts have to have a little bit in. Gee, that's my voice.
Yes. Yeah, so honestly, this has been a fantastic discussion, especially because we were able to give voice to a lot of the questions and I think issues that were not clear, to a lot of people. But I think it is safe to say that we all have agreed unanimously, conclusively, said it is totally all right for anyone to engage with the fabrics. Take note of the difference between appreciating the fabrics, appropriating the fabrics, but then just go ahead and do what your heart tells you to do with the fabrics. We talked about ethical sourcing, really complex. If the best thing you can do is ensure that the person you're buying from in some way has to do with the people of Africa. If you go any further, and then, of course, take note of the quality of what you're buying. That's usually a very good giveaway. The people of Africa are, quality is the first thing they look out for, the quality of the fabrics. And so that should also be something that you are passionate about. I think we've talked about how to identify the good fabrics. There are little things that you can do to let you know, even in the shop, to let you know, is this cotton, is this not cotton? And you buy from one person, you find it doesn't meet your standard, you really shouldn't go, whether it is made in Africa or it is not made in Africa. There's no need to burden yourself with poor quality items, you know. So I want to say thank you so much to all our guests. Bob and Hollis had to leave. And to Sue and Cheryl, who have stayed on to the end, and everyone who has been in the chat, dropping comments. You know, Toya said that this has been informative and insightful. Thank you so much for the panel. Beverly says, I love to learn about the patterns of traditional Africa, the culture, the traditions, and then share it with others. Lisa says to keep pushing. People are interested in learning about the culture, and they absolutely love the fabrics, especially African Americans, you know, and you see it in entertainment and the art world, you know, and all of that. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. This brings us to the end of our discussion. And I'm so glad that you've taken away something. So thank you so much. And we look forward to another event where we will talk more. We'll keep talking, you know, we keep learning and we keep pushing. And so keep quilting, keep letting yourself shine, you know, through your works. Thank you so much to our guests. Really appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us. And so everybody, it's good night from me, 10:37 p.m. right here in Abuja. And I think in the regions of 7 a.m. for Sue in Australia. And it's early evening for Cheryl. So thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your